In February of 1879, Emma Smith was dying. She was 74 years old, and her son, Joseph Smith III, came to interview her. Joseph, who was also at this point the president of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a denomination whose central distinguishing claim from the Utah Church was that his father had never practiced polygamy.
He needed a particular answer from her.
And she gave it. She told him, "He had no other wife but me, nor did he, to my knowledge, ever have." End quote. She said Joseph had never taught plural marriage. She said it was against the will of heaven. She put those words in his mouth. The interview was published in October 1879, and Emma had already died in a form she had never reviewed. She couldn't walk it back. She couldn't clarify it. It just became the record.
A deathbed denial from a woman who was there.
In the last weeks of her life, protecting something, her husband or her son's church or her own understanding of what her marriage had been by saying the thing that wasn't true. Emma had been living with that denial for decades by then. The first time she had to decide what to say, what to know, what to unsee, was not in Nauvoo with the women whose names we'll get to. It was in Kirkland, in a barn, with a teenage domestic worker named Fanny Alger who lived in her home.
Emma's deathbed denial began there.
And the Gospel Topics essays, the church's own official documentation of what actually happened, they name her. They name some of the other women. They say it was, and I'm quoting directly from the essay here, an excruciating ordeal.
They do name Emma, and they keep her entirely in Joseph's orbit. Every time she appears in a Gospel Topics essay, it's his reluctance, it's his management, it's his decision about God would accept. It's not about Emma's experience. The ordeal is named, but the mechanism isn't.
They don't ask what the coercion looked like. They don't reckon with the fact that the doctrine made the ordeal possible is still in the canonized scriptures, still in the sealing book, still making claims about these women from beyond the grave. This is what it looks like when an institution discloses just enough, names the women, acknowledges the difficulty, calls it a hard thing faithfully done, and stops exactly where the reckoning would have to begin.
Hannah and Jess, we got away. Now we're unpacking what they won't say. Behind temple walls and cover-ups, we're pouring tea in your coffee cups. It's the post-Mormon post-mortem, digging up what they want forgotten. Trauma, truth, and crime, yeah, we're surviving. It's post-Mormon post-mortem.
Hello, Eternal Family. Welcome to Post-Mormon Postmortem, the podcast where we lovingly sift through the ashes of our former faith, one bizarre belief and repressed memory at a time.
We explore everything from the church's cultural weirdness and doctrinal whiplash to the deep wounds of religious trauma, Mormon true crime, and the messy, glorious road to recovery.
Whether you're freshly out, years removed, or just ex-mo-curious, this really is the right place. We're here to hold space, spill tea, and call out the cultish stuff hiding in plain sight. I'm your host, Hannah.
And I'm Jess.
Okay, we are continuing our conversation of the Gospel Topic essays, and the subject, as you have been able to tell, is plural marriage. There are 4 Gospel Topic essays on plural marriage. The main essay gives the overview. The other 3 split the history into periods. Plural marriage in Kirkland and Nauvoo covers Joseph Smith's practice in the 1830s and 40s. His and others. Plural marriage and families in early Utah covers the open practice in Utah. The Manifesto and the end of plural marriage covers federal pressure and the first and second manifestos. We are starting with Kirkland and Nauvoo. So here's the frame that the church gives the topic of polygamy. Quote, Latter-day Saints believe that monogamy, the marriage of one man and one woman, is the Lord's standing law of marriage. In biblical times, the Lord commanded some of his people to practice plural marriage. After receiving a revelation commanding him to practice plural marriage, Joseph Smith married multiple wives and introduced the practice to close associates. This principle was among the most challenging aspects of the Restoration, for Joseph personally and for other church members.
Monogamy as the standing law, polygamy as a divine exception. Everyone involved doing something difficult and faithful. Joseph was simultaneously and publicly denying this was happening, but that comes later. The frame this essay builds first is hard thing, commanded by God, faithfully done.
Always an exception. And once that frame is in place, then the secrecy, the lies, the denials, the women who were already married, the slut-shaming women who refuse to participate publicly, this all gets absorbed into the frame of God said to do it.
And the frame does the work before the facts arrive.
Joseph Smith married between 30 and 40 women. That number is documented in church-owned genealogical records at Family Search and confirmed in the church's gospel topic essay.
At least 11 of those women were already civilly married to other men at the time of their sealing to Joseph. One was 14 years old.
What did the church do about disclosing any of this publicly at the time?
The essay is direct about it. I'll quote it. Plural marriage was introduced among the early saints incrementally, and participants were asked to keep their actions confidential. They did not discuss their experiences publicly or in writing until after the Latter-day Saints had moved to Utah. The historical record of early plural marriage is therefore thin. Few records of the time provide details, and later reminiscences are not always reliable. Some ambiguity will always accompany our knowledge about this issue. Like the participants, we see through a glass darkly and are asked to walk by faith. End quote.
Participants were asked to keep their actions confidential. So that's another way of saying
That participants were asked to lie. And then, in the same passage, the essay invokes epistemic humility, ambiguity, walk by faith. The institution controlled the disclosure. The institution created the thin record. The thin record is now doing the work of making the history harder to hold.
And you notice that later reminiscences are not always reliable. Okay, despite the fact that if a reminiscence is doing something that we want it to do, then it becomes an eyewitness record. If it's recording something that is unsavory, then, well, you know, those later reminiscences, they're not reliable. This was more than secrecy. Okay, this was coordinated denial, and then for those people who did disclose it, they were publicly called liars.
They were. So let's look at the record. May 26, 1844. Joseph Smith preached from the stand at Nauvoo to the congregation he was simultaneously deceiving. His words, verbatim, quote, "What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives when I can only find one. I am the same man, as innocent as I was 14 years ago, and I can prove them all perjurers." End quote.
He had, at that point, over 30 wives. And he's a smug prick. To stand up there, can you imagine? What a wag. Oh, and everybody just chortled in sycophantic appreciation. Ha ha ha! Oh, what an idea that Joseph should have more than one wife. And then they sat there knowing that he was a bald-faced liar.
They did, because it wasn't just him. In October 1842, the church-owned Times and Seasons published a certificate signed by church leaders and women. It read, "We know of no other rule or system of marriage than the one published from the Book of Doctrine and Covenants." The signers included men who had already been taught about plural marriage or were participating in it.
Yeah, they're super credible. June 7th, 1844, the Nauvoo Expositor published its first issue. It was also its last issue. The lead publisher was William Law, Joseph's former second counselor in the first presidency. He had left 2 months earlier over polygamy, not because he disagreed with it, but because he and Joseph had just had a falling out. He was just as bad as Joseph in every way. And he started spilling the tea and saying what was really happening. So the Nauvoo expositor published details of polygamy that directly contradicted Joseph's public denials.
Right. And then Joseph, acting as mayor of Nauvoo, convened the city council. He declared the paper a public nuisance and ordered the press destroyed. Then he used his simultaneous role as a municipal court judge to dismiss the initial charges against himself.
The outside charge, when Joseph surrendered, was riot for the destruction of the press. The second charge was added at Carthage, treason against Illinois for calling out the Nauvoo militia. Treason was non-bailable. That charge kept him in Carthage jail when the mob came on June 27, 1844. Both charges were still unresolved when he died.
Joseph was publicly and repeatedly denying what he was privately conducting. The people closest to him were signing institutional denials. Emma Smith maintained the denial to her deathbed. Her son built a denomination around it. The trial of faith framing, hard thing faithfully done, was built on documented, coordinated institutional deception. The essay that now acknowledges the practice inherits that framing without examining it.
Mm-hmm. So, Jess, you have polygamy in your family. So can I ask, what was your history of learning about it? What was your understanding? How was it talked about in your family?
So this is, I've thought about this since we've been researching this episode, and it's left me deeply unsettled, frankly. I remember learning when I was small about, how we were descendants of polygamists on my dad's side. My great-great-grandfather had 3 wives, and we are supposedly, I guess we are documentedly, descendants of the 3rd wife. She was the youngest wife. She was not well liked by the others. They called her feisty and kind of unmanageable. I remember my dad talking to me with pride around the idea that his great-grandfather had been able to be a polygamist, had been able to have plural wives. And I've had to sit and think about that now, and to give him grace, I don't think he knows what we're going to talk about next. I don't think he knows what was preached from the pulpit about polygamy, and specifically polygamy versus monogamy. If he did, I don't think the conversations would have been as they were with me. But when I look back at this time when the struggle was so hard for these women as pioneer wives to begin with, but then to layer on top of that the idea that you could have to be shared with another man while already married to someone else, or you would have to share that husband with other wives, that just adds an intense layer of sadness and hardship that I don't think ever needed to be present.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's the private journals and the letters that the plural wives wrote were very different from the public declarations that they made. There's so much pain and heartache there. And it's not like people had access to relationship advice or therapy
No.
or, relationships are hard.
Well, and I have to wonder if, the 3rd wife, the youngest one, was feisty and hard to manage. Could that possibly be because she was so upset about the situation she found herself in? We don't have history. There's no documentation on whether this was something she wanted, she requested, she consented to. She just was the
Right.
3rd wife.
It's so interesting. Do you know how old she was when she married?
I don't.
Okay. So polygamy is, you were not one of the folks raised Mormon who found out about polygamy, later and felt like, wow, why
Mm-mm.
was I never taught this?
No, I grew up in Utah, so we saw, as they're referred to, which isn't it's a little bit of a slur, but everybody calls them pliggies. So you'd see the polygamous families, at the grocery store or something with the long braids and the prairie style dresses. And so it was a known for me growing up.
Right. It was like, who now, but was there a big differentiation made between that's not us, like we don't do that anymore?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I think that was that othering that by calling them the pliggies, it very much drew the line between the current Mormon church and the folks who had somehow remained entrenched in the past.
Yeah, they are obviously like misguided. And I also grew up knowing all about polygamy because growing up in England, if we if I ever shared, like from childhood, what my religion was, the response more often than not was, I mean, either they've never heard of it, what's that? Or, oh, that's that American religion where they have more than one wife.
Ugh.
So I remember um, going home and having obviously had a conversation with someone out in the world and saying to my mum, like, what's that about? Because, this man said, what's your religion? And I said Mormon, and he said it's the one with, and that was my first recollection of hearing that that was something practiced a long time ago. We don't do that anymore. If anybody says that to you, I mean, actually, my parents were just sort of priming me with the missionary message. If anybody says that to you, you just tell them, it was actually sort of like, you just tell them that they're ignorant and shame them. Like, you just make it clear that they don't know what they're talking about and that we don't do that. So I was sort of like, okay, that's something that was done and it's a thing past, but I never had any earth-shattering moment where I learned that Joseph Smith had had multiple wives and thought, why was this kept from me? Because I always thought that was pretty openly talked about in church.
No, but it wasn't. So, but quick pause before we move on. Like, if this episode is starting to land something for you, the most direct way to support the show is through our Buy Me a Coffee link. The link is in the show notes. We read every message. Okay, let's continue. Let's start with the women.
Here's how the essay explains Joseph's marriages to women who were already married to other men.
Yep, go on.
All right, quote, polyandrous marriages may have served to create desired bonds of kinship and union between Joseph and other men. These feelings may also be explained by Joseph's reluctance to enter plural marriage because of the sorrow it would bring his wife Emma. He may have believed that sealings to married women would comply with the Lord's command without requiring him to have normal marriage relationships, because he was all about trying to avoid those normal marriage relationships
Yeah, what a crock of
at
shit.
any cost.
Right. His relationships with other men, his feelings about Emma, his belief about what God would accept. The women who were already married, their husbands, their lives, they're the context for Joseph's interior experience.
Yeah. And watch how this happens again and again. And also how the essay uses the idea of that Joseph may have been doing something. He may have desired to create a bond. He may have been
Maybe.
reluctant. He may have believed, but you really couldn't just pray and ask God and he could not tell you, because
Right.
that's
You were a prophet.
the deal, right? Yeah.
Right.
But instead we're just left to have mere speculation.
But let's look at, one of the tools that he used to kind of frame things from his perspective. There's the angel with the sword. I'm quoting. When God commands a difficult task, he sometimes sends additional messengers to encourage his people to obey. Consistent with this pattern, Joseph told associates that an angel appeared to him 3 times between 1834 and 1842 and commanded him to proceed with plural marriage when he hesitated to move forward. During the third and final appearance, the angel came with a drawn sword, threatening Joseph with destruction unless he went forward and obeyed the commandment fully. Oh, poor guy.
Yeah, what a threat. The essay never connects that story to the women Joseph told it to. It never asks what consent means when the proposal comes from the prophet, and the prophet says that an angel with a sword threatened him with destruction. Can I just say, as a school counselor, I used to have to teach a mandatory lesson every year to every student in the school about healthy and unhealthy relationships. And one of the things that we would go over is if somebody says things like, if you loved me, you would give me the passwords to your phone. If you loved me, you would let me see your text messages. And because I was talking to middle school students, we had to keep it simple, but it was like, if somebody starts something with, if you love me, that's manipulative. Joseph Smith could have done with those lessons.
Yeah, I agreed. He could have.
If you
But
loved me, you wouldn't let the angel destroy me.
Right. But he didn't have those lessons, and so was able then to be a predator. My words. So let's look at these women. Before Zina, before Helen Mar Kimball, those are probably some of the names you've heard. And before the angel's sword was delivered to anyone, there was Fanny Alger.
Yes, she was Joseph's first victim, and the essay gives her one paragraph, which Jess will read in full.
Right. Quote, fragmentary evidence suggests that Joseph Smith acted on the angel's first command by marrying a plural wife, Fanny Alger, in Kirkland, Ohio, in the mid-1830s. Several Latter-day Saints who had lived in Kirtland reported decades later that Joseph Smith had married Alger, who lived and worked in the Smith household, after he had obtained her consent and that of her parents. Little is known about this marriage, and nothing is known about the conversations between Joseph and Emma regarding Alger. After the marriage with Alger ended in separation, Joseph seems to have set the subject of plural marriage aside until after the church moved to Nauvoo, Illinois.
Yeah, that is all that Joseph's first victim gets. She gets 4 sentences and the word fragmentary.
So let's give her a little bit more context. She was a domestic worker in the Smith home. She was born between 1816 or 1817. That record isn't clear. The best historical estimates put her age somewhere between 16 and 19 at the time of the relationship with Joseph. And historians genuinely disagree. And we're going to sit with that uncertainty rather than collapse it.
Yeah, I mean, the essay certainly collapses the whole event in a different direction. It just says, this marriage calls what happens between Joseph and Fanny this marriage, and then moves on. We know there's a lot more to it than that.
And what the essay doesn't include is that Emma noticed Joseph and Fanny were missing. According to an account from William McClellan, who reported a conversation with Emma herself in 1847, Emma went to the barn and found them together. She told McClellan this herself.
McClellan is not a neutral source. He was excommunicated, and his account is secondhand, so we're naming that.
We're naming it because the essay invokes fragmentary evidence to describe the marriage, and then uses the same fragmentation to close the door. But Emma's experience isn't speculative. She was there.
It says nothing is known about the conversation between Joseph and Emma regarding Fanny.
What she told McClellan doesn't make it into those 4 sentences. Nothing is known and we have no record that serves the frame are not the same thing.
Oliver Cowdery knew about it. Oliver Cowdery, the principal scribe to the Book of Mormon, one of the 3 witnesses to the Golden Plates, the first baptized Latter-day Saint, the second elder of the church. He was called to come in and help manage the aftermath. He did not believe what he saw was a legitimate marriage. In January 1838, he wrote to his brother about Joseph's, and this is a direct quote, dirty, nasty, filthy affair of his and Fanny Alger's.
He added, in which I strictly declared that I had never deserted from the truth in the matter, and as I supposed was admitted by himself.
Oliver Cowdery was excommunicated in April 1838, and among the charges were seeking to destroy the character of President Joseph Smith. How galling when you've seen how somebody behaves.
It really is.
He was the closest witness that the institution had to its own founding, And he wouldn't recount what he said about Fanny Alger and Joseph's affair.
But the essay doesn't name him. It doesn't name what he said. It says the evidence is fragmentary and asks us to walk by faith. After the relationship ended, Fanny left the church, married a non-member named Solomon Custer in Indiana in November 1836. She had 9 children, joined the Universalists in 1874, and died in Indianapolis in 1889.
Yeah, she never returned to the church. She deserves a whole episode of her own because there are way more details that we are not able to go into now. She never publicly discussed what had happened to her. When someone wrote to her asking, she wrote back, quote, "That is all a matter of our own, and I have nothing to communicate." Close quote. What trauma?
That is all a matter of our own.
Yep, she kept the rest to herself.
The essay says the marriage, quote, ended in separation, as if it dissolved mutually quietly. What it doesn't say is that Emma discovered it and blew it apart. That Oliver Cowdery, the man who transcribed the Book of Mormon, considered it so dishonest he would not recount his description of it even when it cost him his standing in the church.
Yeah, he lost everything in the church, and he wasn't going to deny it.
Zina Huntington Jacobs, another woman, the second woman that we know about, married to Henry Jacobs. She was 6 months pregnant with his child when she was sealed to Joseph in October 1841. It was her brother Dimmock who delivered the angel's sword account to her. Joseph's life was at stake if she refused, and so she eventually acquiesced. Her words, which the essay does include, are these: "I made a greater sacrifice than to give my life, for I never anticipated again to be looked upon as an honorable woman." End quote.
Okay, so what the essay leaves out is what happens after Joseph died. Brigham Young, who had also married Zina polyandrously in the Nauvoo Temple, because everybody had to have a go, I guess, sent Henry Jacobs, her husband, on a mission to England. Henry wrote letters home from England to a wife who was now living with the church president. Zina's sealings to Joseph and Brigham both remain active under the current doctrine, and Henry has no sealing on record to her. So we know that according to Mormon doctrine, right now in the afterlife, she's living with Joseph and Brigham.
Poor thing. There's Helen Mar Kimball. Many of us have heard her name. The essay says this about her, quote, "The youngest was Helen Mar Kimball, daughter of Joseph's close friends Heber C. and Vilate Murray Kimball, who was sealed to Joseph several months before her 15th birthday. Marriage at such an age, inappropriate by today's standards, was legal in that era, and some women married in their mid-teens." Disbelief that comes from me, not the essay.
Yeah, several months before her 15th birthday means 14. And if 14 was normal and appropriate by the standards of the day, they could have just said she was 14, but they didn't.
No. According to historian Richard Van Wagner, and I'm flagging this as a secondary source, Van Wagner's Mormon Polygamy, A History, Helen later said, quote, "I would never have been sealed to Joseph had I known it was anything more than ceremony. I was young and they deceived me by saying the salvation of our whole family depended on it."
Her father was Heber C. Kimball, first counselor in the first presidency. And he allowed his 14-year-old daughter to marry Joseph Smith or be married to Joseph Smith. But this is what he was preaching from the pulpit in church. This is from the Journal of Discourses. Quote, "I have noticed that a man who has but one wife and is inclined to that doctrine soon begins to wither and dry up, while a man who goes into plurality looks fresh, young, and sprightly. Why is this? Because God loves that man and because he honors his word. Some of you may not believe this, but I not only believe it, but I know it. For a man of God to be confined to one woman is small business."
So this 14-year-old, Helen Mar Kimball, her father preached that from the pulpit, that God's love made visible in how fresh a polygamous man looks. What? The angel sword, the family salvation framing? But then here's her father's theology underneath all of it.
So Joseph used this trial of faith language with the women that he was proposing to, right? He reportedly told prospective wives that plural marriage would be, quote, the hardest trial the saints would ever have to test their faith, close quote. But Hebe Kimball also said that it made men all young and fresh and sprightly, so I guess it was only hard on the women?
Only apparently so.
Like the men, it's like you're highly favored and blessed of God. But if a woman hesitated, then that meant she had insufficient faith. And obviously, if you accepted, then that meant that you were worthy. The essay inherited that frame. It cannot examine it from inside it. The essay's treatment of Emma gets 3 sentences.
Go ahead.
All right. Plural marriage was difficult for all involved. For Joseph's wife, Emma, it was an excruciating ordeal. Records of Emma's reaction to plural marriage are sparse. She left no first-hand accounts, making it impossible to reconstruct her thoughts.
Sparse records cannot reconstruct her thoughts.
Well, D&C 132, currently in the standard works, studied in Sunday school and canonized in 1879, in verse 54, it's addressed to Emma Smith by name. It says, "And I command mine handmaid Emma Smith to abide and cleave unto my servant Joseph, and to none else. But if she will not abide this commandment, she shall be destroyed, saith the Lord. If you love me, you'll let me destroy you."
His name is in the canonized scripture. The threat to her is in the canonized scripture. The secrecy of the practice made firsthand accounts nearly impossible to produce. So the essay uses the absence of those accounts to close the door on questions the scripture it cites holds open.
Yeah. The essay documents the angel with the sword and the women's reluctance and how it's framed that it's going to save your family. And the threat to Emma is in the canonized scripture, but it doesn't use the word consent anywhere.
No, it never asks what consent means when the cost of refusal is divine destruction and it's been communicated to you by the prophet of God in your very own community. From 1852 to 1890, church leaders were not describing polygamy from church pulpits as a difficult trial, mercifully discontinued.
No. Wildly enough, when they got to Utah and could practice it openly, they were describing monogamy as a disease to civilization.
Brigham Young, church president, June 18th, 1865. The Journal of Discourses, Volume 11. Quote, "Since the founding of the Roman Empire, monogamy has prevailed more extensively than in times previous to that. The founders of that ancient empire were robbers and women stealers, and made laws favoring monogamy in consequence of the scarcity of women among them. And hence this monogamic system which now prevails throughout Christendom, and which has been so fruitful a source of prostitution and whoredom throughout all the Christian monogamous cities of the Old and New World, until rottenness and decay are at the root of their institutions, both national and religious."
Journal Discourses were sermon transcripts published with First Presidency approval. So Brigham Young personally edited this series. He was fine with having this go out to the world.
Mm-hmm. And Orson Pratt, the apostle who announced polygamy publicly to the world in 1852, has this to say, also from the Journal of Discourses in Volume 13, October 1869. Quote, "This law of monogamy, or the monogamic system, laid the foundation for prostitution and the evils and diseases of the most revolting nature and character under which modern Christendom groans."
So Pratt's logic, and Brigham Young's, is that monogamy produces surplus unmarried women. Okay, let's just
Mm-hmm.
accept that. Okay, those women have natural feelings with no legitimate outlet. Polygamy solves this by giving every woman a husband, even though I thought it wasn't supposed to be about sex. And
Right.
then inside that framework, marrying women already married to other men isn't an aberration somehow. It's just a natural conclusion. How
Right.
does this work?
It doesn't work, but it's not just these two. George Q. Cannon, who was a first presidency counselor, here's him in the Journal of Discourses, Volume 13. Quote, "It is a fact worthy of note that the shortest-lived nations of which we have record have been monogamic. Rome, with her arts, sciences, and warlike instincts, was once the mistress of the world, but her glory faded. She was a monogamic nation, and the numerous evils attending that system early laid the foundation for that ruin which eventually overtook her."
I didn't realize that Rome crumbled because
Because
they
of
were monogamous.
monogamy. I'm
But
shocked.
you learn something all the time. Yeah, if you sit and listen to,
Bullshit.
if you sit and listen to bullshit, you can absorb some bullshit. And that is what Zina Huntington Jacobs and Helen Mar Kimball and all these other innocent women were living inside. Okay, not just the angel's sword. It's this theology, right, preached as God's truth from the pulpits of church where they were sitting, telling them that all of this is legit.
But so then there's this manifesto that happens. Hannah, what did the manifesto actually abandon when it was first drafted in 1890?
Well, the manifesto in 1890 technically and nominally abandoned an entire theological framework that had been preached as divine truth for 40 years by the men who led the institution.
Well, I think you should read the manifesto. Let's hear it.
Yeah, okay. Pay attention to the words, because as I said, nominally abandoned this. Quote, "We are not teaching polygamy or plural marriage, nor permitting any person to enter into its practice. Inasmuch as laws have been enacted by Congress forbidding plural marriages, which laws have been pronounced constitutional by the court of last resort, I hereby declare my intention to submit to those laws." That was Wilford Woodruff.
God does not appear in that document. DNC 132 describes plural marriage as, quote, "a new and everlasting covenant." The manifesto does not say the everlasting covenant was revoked. It does not say that it was suspended. It doesn't say what everlasting means now. The question has never been formally answered.
Yeah, the practice continued. The practice continued after the manifesto. The Church's essay says, quote, "Like the beginning of plural marriage in the church, the end of the practice was a process rather than a single event," close quote. So apostles continued performing plural marriages after 1890, not rogue members, apostles. John W. Taylor fled to Canada rather than testify at Senate hearings. Matthias Cowley performed plural marriages after the manifesto.
So then in March 1904, Church President Joseph F. Smith, testifying before the Senate during the Reed-Smoot hearings, said this, quote, "There never has been a plural marriage by the consent or sanction or knowledge or approval of the Church since the manifesto." End quote.
Okay, so we know that the church acknowledges that plural marriages continued after 1890 with the involvement of church leaders. So how then would you be okay with your church leaders just straight up lying to Congress? Well, the apologist framing is that, Smith was making a careful distinction between individual members who had acted independently and formal institutional sanction, like, one of the apostles performing the marriage. So whether or not that is technically lying, that's a question only you can answer. And whether or not you want people in your own life to be as honest with you as Smith was being with Congress is
Fair
also up
point.
to the individual.
So then there's the second manifesto, which came, April at the General Conference in 1904. Joseph F. Smith again, speaking here, I quote.
Known truth teller.
So Joseph F. Smith again, speaking here, quote, I hereby affirm and declare that no such marriages have been solemnized with the sanction, consent, or knowledge of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
And again, the Church's own records show that statement to be false as written. Oh, integrity.
Oh, integrity. There's a position circulating right now. It's no longer fringe YouTube. It's actually among active, faithful, believing members of the LDS Church. And the position is this, that Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy, that D&C 132 was fabricated by Brigham Young after the martyrdom. Radio Free Mormon and Mormon Stories have both brought in professional historians specifically to respond to it, and the church has reportedly disciplined members who teach it.
Yeah, we're naming it because you will encounter it if you are in any kind of online space. What that historical argument requires is, for everybody to be liars, for Zina Huntington Jacobs' own words that she made a greater sacrifice than to give her life. She was lying, and Helen Mar Kimball's account of being deceived, she was lying. The revisionist position cannot afford any of the women to be telling
It
the truth.
can't.
You have to make them
No.
all false. I might be wrong. I think it might be Denver Snuffer and the remnant movement that really popularized this idea that Joseph Smith didn't practice polygamy. And I think it's because those folk can't stand the idea that the person they call a prophet is that kind of charlatan, that kind of grifter, that kind of abuser, emotional, sociopathic, manipulator.
Whether they can stand it or not, Joseph's practice of plural marriage is documented in church-owned genealogical records. It is confirmed by the church's own essays, and it's attested by contemporary witnesses. And Fanny Alger is specifically what that position cannot survive.
The argument is that D&C 132, as you said, was fabricated by Brigham Young after Joseph's death, and that the polygamy attributed to Joseph was Brigham's invention, that he retroactively attributed and attached to Joseph, who therefore couldn't deny it. Which would then make Brigham Young what kind of person?
Very, very devious.
So, right, it gets... if Joseph Smith didn't practice polygamy, then that makes Brigham Young worse than we know him to be.
Right. And he's pretty freaking bad.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
I have to add, Oliver Cowdery's letter to his brother is dated January 21st, 1838, 6 years before Joseph died, 8 years before Brigham Young led anything. And it describes Joseph's relationship with Fanny Alger in terms that are not ambiguous about what Cowdery believed had happened. The letter is held at the Huntington Library. It is cited in the Joseph Smith papers. It's not a Brigham Young document.
Yeah, the revisionist position requires Oliver Cowdery to have been lying or wrong in his private letter to his brother that nobody else was going to read in 1838.
And it requires Emma Smith, who went to the barn and saw Joseph with Fanny, to be lying.
And it requires Fanny Alger, who left the church and never came back, to just be a rumor?
Right. So as we said, the position cannot afford the women, and it especially cannot afford the woman who was first.
Really quick, if you want to support what we are doing, please take a minute. We so appreciate you to hit like or subscribe or follow wherever you are listening, or you can find us on Patreon or buy me a coffee, both are linked in the show notes. Okay, to the doctrine that didn't end.
So the essay closes with this, quote, Some ambiguity will always accompany our knowledge about this issue. Like the participants, we see through a glass darkly and are asked to walk by faith. End quote.
So the essay has documented what happened, but now ambiguity is invoked about asking, what does all of this mean?
Right. And the answer the essay gives us is walk by faith. The Gospel Topics essay on race and the priesthood contains this language. The quote goes like this: "The church disavows the theories advanced in the past," end quote, that were used to justify the priesthood ban. So here the institution is saying in its own voice that the theological framework used to justify a practice was wrong.
Yeah. Explicitly, the polygamy essays, they don't have any equivalent statements. There is no disavowal language, saying that we no longer practice something is not the same as saying we disavow that was ever practiced.
So let's look at this. You have Heber C. Kimball preaching that a man with one wife withers. Orson Pratt on monogamy as the foundation of prostitution. The angel with the drawn sword. That framework is still in the standard works. It's still in the curriculum. And it's still governing the eternal expectations of living members.
Yeah, we were taught in seminary Doctrine and Covenants 132, right? We are taught that scripture, that's still there, that's still being taught. And Doctrine and Covenants 132 makes it clear that this is an eternal law. And so we know, and you were taught this, Jess, and I was taught this, and I know both of our mothers have talked about the fact that in the eternities, they will just have to eat shit and deal with the fact that their husbands will have multiple wives, and like
Right.
it or not, and they don't. It's like, we don't like it, but
Heavenly
it's
Father will make it all okay.
yeah,
Right.
exactly. That's sort of like the lifeline that my mum hangs on to. It's that Heavenly Father will make it all right. And it's like, that's what you have to keep telling yourself. Okay,
It
so
is. Yeah.
you're exactly right. It is governing the eternal expectations of living members. So speaking of D&C that we were taught in seminary, verse 4 says, quote, "For behold, I reveal unto you a new and everlasting covenant. And if ye abide not that covenant, then ye are damned. For no one can reject this covenant and be permitted to enter into my glory."
Everlasting. That word has not been addressed. The Church's General Handbook, updated as recently as August 2024, states that a man can be sealed to multiple women, whether living or deceased. A man whose wife has died can be sealed to a second wife without canceling the first sealing. Both sealings remain active simultaneously. A woman whose husband has died cannot be sealed to another man without canceling the first sealing.
I'm actually surprised at how few current active Mormons know that they will be required to practice plural marriage in the afterlife. Because years ago, I ran into someone who was Mormon, and I said, "Oh, I was raised Mormon." And she said, "Oh, yeah, people always say, like, oh, Mormons, you have multiple wives." And I say, "Oh, we don't do that anymore." And I looked at her and thought, you're going to do it in the next life, right? Like, do you know that? Because the
Right,
way
we
she said,
canonized this whole concept so that Joseph Smith could sleep with as many women as he wanted.
the idea of the
Dude, you're
celestial
doing it.
polygamy, it hasn't gone away. It's still in the handbook. It's not going anywhere. But she seems to not know that. She thought it was like a thing of the past. It's like for now, they hit pause
Right. But
because they were getting
yeah,
arrested and putting in prison.
that's all it did. So the Gospel Topics essays were published without a byline. There was no named author or authors, no institutional voice to direct any follow-up questions toward. So the essay is just the floor of what had to be said to remain credible in the internet age.
Yeah, for those members who needed the documented history to be somewhere official, or to know, like, where does the church actually land on this topic? Well, now they have something official.
They do. And disclosure is not accountability. Naming is not reckoning. Fanny Alger left Kirtland in 1836, married a non-member, had 9 kids, and joined the Universalists. As I said earlier, she died in Indianapolis in 1889.
She has no sealing on record. The church holds no ongoing claim to her eternity, not the way it holds Zina's or Helen Mar Kimball's.
No, she is the only one of these women who got out from under it entirely. Not because the institution released her, because she walked away before the doctrine had fully formed and never gave it the chance to close around her.
Exactly. And that was Oliver Cowdery's whole point. The supposed restoration of this eternal law of plural marriage, even by Joseph Smith's reckoning, even by Joseph Smith's storytelling, hadn't happened at the time of Fanny Alger. So even within the polygamy framework and the God commanded this framework, that predates that. The essay calls the evidence fragmentary, even though we know what happened. And Fanny Alger called it a matter of her own. Trauma.
Zina Huntington Jacobs died in 1901, sealed to both Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. Henry Jacobs, the one who was sent on a mission to England while Brigham moved in, died in 1879. Both of Zina's sealings remain under current doctrine, and she has no mechanism to contest what the church says about her now.
Helen Mar Kimball died in 1896. She wrote that she was deceived, that the salvation of her whole family was used to secure her answer at 14 years old. The handbook still structures the eternal framework she was pulled into.
Emma Smith died in 1879, 2.5 months after telling her son that Joseph had no other wife but her. She was the named subject of a revelation that threatened her with destruction if she refused. The essay says her ordeal was excruciating. The revelation that produced the ordeal is still in the standard works. The essay told you what happened. It asked you to walk by faith about what that means.
Yeah, we have talked about just a few of the women that were touched by the issue of polygamy. Zina, she walked by faith. Helen Mar Kimball walked by faith. Emma Smith walked by faith. The doctrine that required it is still in the scriptures.
If you had a quick flash of anger thinking of these women and what this early doctrine cost them, consider buying us a coffee. Every contribution, whether $5 or $25, helps us keep doing the research, putting the pieces together, and calling out the lack of accountability for all the harm the church has caused. The link is in the show notes.
Before we go, many thanks to Hannah W. and her incredible voice for our theme song, to Dr. Dave for his extra guitar work, and to Mick for making it all sound professional. And Jess, looking back on all of this, as always, I have to say, I am sorry for what I said when I was Mormon.
Me too, Hannah. I'm sorry for what I said when I was Mormon too.